This is a part of the world where the threat of terrorism has increased. That's a major threat to Western democracies. The epicenter of terrorism globally isn't based on nothing. From the al-Qaeda side, we have al-shabaab operating across Somalia, across the border into Kenya to a degree as well, and perhaps in the future into Ethiopia a little bit. Then most significant other al-Qaeda aligned group is Jainim, who are primarily active in the border areas between Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger historically, but also now very important in the last sort of month or two as they seek to blockade the capital of Mali, Bamako. So those are probably the two most significant al-Qaeda aligned groups. And then on the Islamic State side, a variety of affiliates across the continent. The Islamic State Central Africa province, who are effectively the Allied Democratic Forces in eastern DRC. Islamic State Mozambique, who are a sort of quite a local insurgency operating out of Cabo Delgado. Then Islamic State in Somalia. And then moving west, there's Boko Haram, who are operating in the Cameroon-Nigeria border. Their links to Islamic State a little bit less clear. But Islamic State West Africa province, operating in the Lake Chad Basin and across sort of four countries, Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon and Chad. We need to be really careful not to generalize across the continent. As I've said, there's a huge number of groups, really diverse in their objectives and sizes and influence. And actually, according to the Global Terrorism Index, deaths from terrorism in sub-Saharan Africa decreased across 10 countries last year. So there have been some improvements seen in the last sort of 12 months across much of the continent. But undeniably, if we look at sort of Global Terrorism Index and ACLED statistics, this is a part of the world where the threat of terrorism has increased compared to many other parts of the world where over the last sort of 5 years it has decreased considerably. There's been an increase in incidents in sub-Saharan Africa pretty much the last sort of 10 years. It's spiked since sort of the mid-2000s in particular, sort of mid-2010s in particular. ACLED shows an 86% of all Islamic State activity in the first quarter of this year, so January to March this year, occurred in Africa, which is a pretty frightening statistic. Deaths have increased in particular in the last year in DRC and Nigeria, despite the decreases elsewhere. Number of Islamic State's attacks have doubled in the last year, mainly due to incidents in DRC and Nigeria. And 22 countries on the continent continue to experience jihadist violence. So this sort of narrative around sub-Saharan Africa being the epicenter, is a bit of language you often hear, of terrorism globally, isn't based on nothing. But it's this Islamic State West Africa province that is undoubtedly the most significant of those three movements, attacking military bases over the last 12 months primarily, and infrastructure, and sort of looking to expand their sort of territorial influence. Two separate incidents of attacks by US aircraft. Firstly, in December 2025, there was an incident in sort of northwest Nigeria, in Sokoto state, in which as many as 200 fighters, maybe more, were killed in a US airstrike, which was approved by the Nigerian government. Reporting is a little bit unclear. It suggests in some cases that they were targeting Islamic State West Africa province, in other cases that they were targeting this sort of Lakurawa movement. There's been further strikes in Borno state against much more clearly defined Islamic State West Africa province fighters. But really the narrative around it is, as you'll have seen, has been that Trump is sort of targeting Islamic State affiliates, whoever they may be, who are apparently responsible for targeting Christians. The narrative is really questionable. The claims are not logical. The Nigerian government themselves has dismissed the narrative, suggesting that 50 of almost 2,000 attacks. I think they cited ACLED data since January 2020 have targeted Christians. Christians, make up a tiny minority of northern Nigeria. and the majority of victims of this violence are not Christians. This is an area, firstly, that is forested. It's not a territory which is sort of conducive to airstrikes being successful in ending an insurgency. And as we've seen across the world, airstrikes inevitably lead to the creation of more opposition, more animosity against the state, more animosity against security forces, and ultimately a weakening of that social contract between sort of communities and the government, but also greater dislike of Western influence. Such operations invariably ultimately lead to increased support for extremists. Following these US attacks, there's suggestions that poor intelligence led to targets being missed completely, the wrong people being targeted. And what we've seen, although IS affiliates in northern Nigeria are pretty quiet after these attacks, what we have seen is an increase in ISWAP violence following these incidents, sort of demonstrations that they haven't worked. Historically not a particularly effective counter-terrorism tool, airstrikes. We did a really large study looking at social norms on the Kenya-Somalia border and how that affects, how that drives recruitment. And what we're trying to do is see this more as the ways these groups operate as part of a conflict system rather than sort of a very formal recruitment agency, if you like. You don't get a membership card for joining al-shabaab. These are individuals who might lack employment opportunities. They're in areas which receive very few services from the state. They may experience violence on part of security forces. And at the same time, they're expected as young men, for example, to provide, to protect their families. And in that context, Shabab's propaganda messaging will suggest that that joining them or fighting on their behalf will allow them to provide for their family, will allow them to protect their family, will allow them to restore their dignity, restore their pride and their family pride. We've seen the same sort of narrative and messaging from extremist groups in West Africa. So that's not to say that the ideology that Shabab are offering is not equally important, and a lot of the time the messaging is framed in religious terms. Sub-Saharan Africa now faces, I think, three major challenges looking forward. A massively growing young population, which has been written about quite a bit, but I think what that means for unemployment and for young people and violence in the next 20, 30 years is not often discussed enough, combined with decreased livelihood opportunities as a result of climate change. And then at the state level, this monumental and unsustainable levels of debt. Broadly speaking, that the long-term solutions to these problems, which is something I'd love to focus on more, is not military, it's not coercive, it's not counter-terrorism, it's preventive, it's longer-term governance, it's soft power solutions in the US. The way the US sees this, it's about spending some money now towards supporting governance, service provision, humanitarianism, development initiatives, infrastructure, so that in the long term these groups don't expand and that they don't present a threat to Western interests that could ultimately lead to much more expensive solutions in the long term. The potential for ISWAP, al-Shabaab right now, to launch attacks on Western soil is low. There's no denying that. But that these groups have could have an impact on Western interests is very different. So there's real signs. Firstly, a jihadist-controlled Somalia, which is not implausible, would potentially lead to an influx of foreign fighters, which we haven't seen for a long time. So that would, that's a major threat to Western democracies. The potential also for those groups to target UK, US interests in the region itself is really high. On the West is short-sighted and simplistic. We're not saying that US and say British interests in sub-Saharan Africa are significant, and the potential for tourists, for investments to be targeted remains high.